You know, when we talk about cannabis and the brain, the conversation almost always goes straight to the risks, especially for younger people. But what if I told you that a brand new study is flipping that whole script on its head, and it has everything to do with the aging brain?
I know, it sounds completely backward, doesn't it? For decades, we've pretty much heard one story, and one story only, about cannabis and brain health. But some new science is forcing us to stop and ask, is there a different, much more complicated story we should be telling?
And this isn't just some wild speculation. This is the main headline from a new study that uncovered a link that, honestly, surprised even the researchers themselves. So let's get into it and break down what they actually found.
Okay, first up, let's look at the connection itself, this surprising link they uncovered, and just the sheer scale of the data they were working with here. It's pretty incredible.
So the reason this study is getting so much attention is its size. Researchers tapped into this massive database called the UK Biobank, and they analyzed data from over 26,000 adults. That is a huge sample. And across this massive group, the overall finding was pretty consistent. Greater lifetime use was linked to larger brain volumes.
And this quote from the lead researcher, Dr. Annika Guha, really gets to the heart of why this is so important right now. You see, more and more older adults are using cannabis, a lot of times for things like chronic pain or to help with sleep. So figuring out the long-term effects isn't just some academic exercise anymore, it's become a real public health question.
All right, so how is this even possible? To really wrap our heads around what these findings could mean, we got to kind of pop the hood and take a quick look at the biology of what's happening inside an aging brain.
So the key thing they were measuring in this study is something called regional brain volume. The easiest way to think about it is like the size of different neighborhoods in your brain. Now, as we get older, it's totally normal for some of these areas to shrink a little bit. That process is called atrophy, and it's often linked to cognitive decline. Now, here is the part that just seems to go against everything we've been told. The study found that in cannabis users, having larger volumes in key brain regions, we're talking areas crucial for memory, like the hippocampus, was actually correlated with better performance on cognitive tests. Better learning, better memory, faster processing speed, the whole shebang.
So what's the big idea here? Well, the researchers don't think this means cannabis is somehow growing the brain. The more likely interpretation is that it might be helping to preserve it, maybe slowing down that natural age-related shrinking process and in turn helping to maintain brain function for longer.
But of course, with science, it's never quite that simple. When you really dig into the data, you start to see some important complexities that add a whole lot of nuance to the story.
For instance, when the researchers broke people down into groups, no use, moderate use, and high use, a really fascinating pattern showed up. For a lot of these measurements, it was actually the moderate users who had the best outcomes. They had the largest brain volumes and the strongest cognitive performance. It suggests this classic Goldilocks effect, not too little, not too much.
And this finding led Dr. Guha to a really clear conclusion. These are what you call dose-dependent effects. In other words, how much you use really matters, and more is definitely not always better. That right there is a critical piece of this whole puzzle.
The researchers also found that your sex seems to play a role. Now, it wasn't a simple case of it's better for men or better for women. It was more complex than that. But the effects weren't uniform, which could be due to all sorts of things from hormones to just different ways men and women tend to use cannabis.
And this brings us to a really crucial point. Before anybody gets the wrong idea, we have to talk about the caveats, because this research is definitely not a simple green light for cannabis use. It's complicated.
Because for all of those positive associations they found, there was one big exception. A single brain region where the relationship was completely flipped, where more cannabis use was actually linked to a smaller brain volume. That region was the posterior cingulate, which is another area involved in memory and learning. What exactly this means isn't clear yet, but it's a powerful reminder that the effects of cannabis on the brain are not one-sided at all. There are clearly multiple, maybe even competing things going on.
And that's exactly what the lead researcher emphasizes. This is not a simple story of good or bad. It's a much more nuanced picture, and that one contradictory finding is a perfect example of why we need to be careful.
But maybe the biggest caveat of all, the one that kind of hangs over this entire study, is a simple question. The data is based on lifetime use. And for a lot of these older folks, that use started decades ago. So what were they actually using?
See, the UK Biobank data, for all its power, couldn't tell the researchers any of this stuff.
They have no idea about the potency, the THC versus CBD levels, how people were consuming it, or even why they were using it in the first place. These are absolutely huge missing variables.
And this context is so crucial to remember. The cannabis from 20, 30, or 40 years ago was, on average, way less potent than many of the products you can find in legal markets today. So we absolutely cannot just take these findings and apply them directly to modern cannabis. We need a lot more research.
So, after all that, where does this leave us? What should we really be taking away from this fascinating but, yeah, pretty complicated new research?
If you remember just one thing from all of this, let it be this. The relationship between cannabis and the aging brain is not what we might have assumed. It is complex, it's dose-dependent, and it is far from being all good or all bad.
So why does this matter? Well, first, it seriously challenges some old, simplistic ideas. Second, and this is probably the most important point, this is absolutely not a recommendation to use cannabis for brain health. And third, it's basically a giant flashing sign for scientists that we urgently need more research to help guide public health and policy, especially as these products get more common.
You know, a study like this really opens a door. It suggests there's still so many unknowns about the substances people are using every single day. And it kind of leaves you wondering, as we get better tools and bigger sets of data, what other secrets about the intricate ways our choices shape our long-term health are just waiting to be discovered.